Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the first of the three tiny new G prime lenses that are coming from Sony, and I'm kind of testing them all as a series, and I'll be releasing individual reviews for you as we move along. These include the 24mm F2.8, which we're reviewing today, 40mm F2.5, and then 50mm F2.5 prime lenses. Sony has followed a similar pattern to what Tamron did in late 2019, in that they also released three prime lenses at the same time, a 20mm, 24mm, and 35mm f2.8 prime lenses for Sony. And those lenses had a very, very high degree of shared design, mechanical and some optical design as well. Identical housings, and that's essentially what we have here as well, though like with those Tamron lenses, the only tweaks are really in the lens hood integration itself. And so that allows a couple of things to happen. First of all, it allows Sony to produce these at a cheaper price point because there's less upfront engineering costs, because there's some shared engineering, and then also there's some shared tooling that comes with the manufacturing of the lenses themselves. And so the nice thing is that these lenses come to us fully featured, very, very nice build qualities, we'll see in a moment, but at a price point of $599 US, which obviously is considerably cheaper than what they were charging for similar type lenses that were first introduced on this platform, where it wasn't uncommon for, the little Sony Zeiss primes, even if they had a maximum aperture of f2.8 like this one, to be priced more in the $800 or $900 range. And so it's, it's a relief to see these priced at a more reasonable price point, though I think that there are some different market forces at work. At this stage, you've got a lot of alternatives to this 24mm f2.8 lens, including the Sigma 24mm f3.5 I-series lens, beautiful build quality, nice optical performance. You have also the aforementioned Tamron 24mm f2.8, and while it has a smaller maximum aperture, not as nice a build, and certainly the autofocus performance isn't as good. It's also $200, and on top of that, it has an interesting trick up its sleeve in having a 1 to 2 or 0.50 times magnification, much higher than what we see on this lens. And I think probably the most tempting alternative to this lens, at least in my opinion, is the recently released Samyang 24mm f1.8 that may be their best lens ever. And while its build quality isn't as nice as this, it's got a lot of great stuff going on for it, and it retails for $100 cheaper. So there are some alternatives out there, and I think that that's what helped keep this price at a more reasonable price point. Now today we're doing the definitive review where we'll look at everything in terms of performance, handling, autofocus in detail. And if you want a quicker overview type review, you can check out the standard review instead. Today's episode is brought to you by Lens Nest, the stylish and innovative new way to store and display your lenses. This new product is designed and produced by a fellow photographer and is made with high-quality cork, a biodegradable material that has been extracted as a byproduct during the process of manufacturing cork bottle stoppers. This makes the Lens Nest eco-friendly, along with being natural and highly durable. Lens Nest is designed to be expandable to fit your growing collection of lenses. Visit bit.ly/lensnest to join the Kickstarter campaign to help to bring this stylish new lens storage system to market. Again, that's visit bit.ly/lensnest today to get on board. So we're going to start by taking a look at the build and the features of this little lens that, while tiny, has a lot packed into it. Let's jump in closer and take a look. So as you can see, there is a tremendous amount of shared design elements on all three of these new lenses from Sony. In fact, they all have the same external dimensions, which is 68 millimeters in diameter, 45 millimeters in length. That's 2.7 inches or only 1.8 inches in length. And the weight varies just a little bit, 162 grams is the 24mm, and then the 40 and 50mm lenses are roughly 10 and 11 grams heavier. So all of them are really lightweight, and in fact shockingly so when you consider how nice the build quality is. These are all metal construction and actually are quite feature rich in a lot of ways, and so to have that small amount of weight is really quite impressive. But they achieve that in large part by making these lenses so incredibly compact, and they truly are really compact lenses. And so if you're one of the people that prioritizes traveling light, you are definitely going to potentially love this series. Now, the profile changes a little bit when you insert the hood into the three lenses. So the 40 and then the 50mm lenses, they both have a rather unique hood slash filter adapter that bayonets on the front, and so it comes down to a 49mm front filter thread, but you can't put filters directly on the lens. It is only on the lens hood slash filter adapter, and so that changes the profile of those a little bit, whereas the 24mm has a much more traditional look to it and a more traditional lens hood, and it's actually threaded for filters on the lens itself, though also in a 49mm filter thread. Inside there are 7 rounded blades, though frankly I didn't find them all that rounded. Even stopping down to f4, you can definitely see the shape of the aperture blades, and it looks fairly straight to me. But the upside is that you can produce decent looking sun stars when you stop the lens down. Now in this case, our minimum focus distance is only 24 centimeters for this lens. So that's not exactly particularly close, and so it gives it a lower magnification than other competing lenses. You can increase that figure a little bit if you manually focus. Manually focusing allows you to get 6 centimeters closer and increases the magnification to somewhere around 0.17 or 0.18 times. But no matter what, your final figure is going to be much lower than the competing lenses. There's actually quite a bit of features that are here. There is a really thorough, shockingly thorough weather sealing that starts with a gasket at the lens mount, and a lot of internal seals, a total of 10 different seal points, which is impressive when you consider how tiny the lens itself is. And in fact, really the build and the features is very similar to a miniaturized G Master lens. You've got the focus hold button, you've got the AF/MF switch on the side, though I will note of the button and the switches here that because they're so miniaturized, I noted that they're not particularly easy to find even with my bare hands in winter when I'm wearing gloves. Forget about it. It's going to be really hard to access those when you're wearing gloves. It also has the G Master approach to aperture, in that you have an aperture ring here, though a very slim one, and there's not much distance between it and the manual focus ring because of how tight the real estate is on the lens barrel. But you can either have it in 1/3 click detents. You can switch it into an auto mode with a nice, firm, definite detent in between f/22, which is minimum aperture, and then automatic. But then you can also, like the G Master lenses, you can select a switch on the other side that will declick the aperture, and so that you can smoothly rack throughout it without any kind of stops in between. There is, of course, the manual focus ring that is fully linear, and it's nicely damped. It's a fairly nice focus experience, though once again, if you're wearing gloves, it's going to be hard to distinguish between the aperture and the manual focus ring just because they're so close together. I'm not going to fault Sony too much for that, because obviously this is a really tiny lens and they tried to fit a lot into it, which I appreciate. So at the end of the day, you've got a beautiful build quality here and nice functionality so long as you're not wearing gloves. So really, outside of everything really kind of being tiny and close together, which you really can't avoid in a lens that's this small, I think that this lens has a beautiful build quality, and it's very similar to the Sigma 24mm F3.5 from their I series, in that it feels very much like just a miniaturized premium lens. And that's really what we've got here. And also a few of those design elements that kind of remind me of a Cine lens, in that the manual focus and the aperture ring are raised and ribbed out from the lens barrel, and it kind of just reminds me a bit of something like that. Equally impressive here is the autofocus performance. I was actually surprised to find, when I was doing research on the lens as a part of my review, that it's been equipped with dual linear motors. Now, it's not surprising in that the use of dual or even quad linear motors is fairly common with Sony's lenses, but very often I'm seeing the dual linear motor setup in lenses that are a little bit higher end, number one, but also have a little bit larger maximum aperture combination to work with. And so in some ways, I kind of think that maybe it was a little bit overkill in this case, but I'm not going to complain because you have great autofocus here. And like other lenses so equipped from Sony, you end up with very fast, very quiet, and very smooth autofocus that just works well in all tested situations. And so that includes if I'm doing focus pulls, which as you can see are utterly silent, very smooth and quick. Also, I noted when I did my test where I'm approaching the camera and it's tracking my face that all the transitions were nice and smooth, that it stayed accurately with me. Even when I moved in more quickly towards the camera, it enabled me to have good face tracking. So obviously that is a positive as well. Another thing that I noted is that it did a good job of, if I switched into, say, animal tracking, I got down low and was taking some photos of Loki outside, and you can see from these shots, there's just really, really crisp focus, great detail. So he's doing a good job tracking his face. He's quite active, and so delivering at the moment of capture, very good end results. So as I've been saying recently in other such Sony reviews, I really think that Sony has nailed the formula with their current lenses, that their linear motor systems, they're just doing all the things that you would want as a part of autofocus, and thus, I got accurately focused results in all tested situations. I'm very, very happy with the autofocus that we have got in the 24mm f2.8 G lens. And so great stuff there. I mean, this is going to be a compelling option for those even that want to do video and want a really lightweight lens, something compact to bring along. This is going to be very, very appealing. That linear focus, manual focus is going to be tempting. And then of course, just great autofocus in general, the ability to declick the aperture, all of those things add up to some intriguing options for filmmakers. So ultimately, how about the image quality itself? We're going to dive into a deep dive of the image quality, a few comparison points, and so let's jump in and take a look at that. Now, as a first-party lens, the 24mm f2.8 G benefits from having great profile correction. I was actually really surprised when I turned those corrections off to find out just how much the lens was relying on those electronics to help to correct for a massive amount of barrel distortion and fairly heavy vignette as well. I've very rarely seen distortion this heavy. The last time I saw this on a prime lens was the Tamron 20mm f2.8, and it's about an equal amount of barrel distortion. And as you can see here from my manual correction on the right, there is a little bit of a very slight wave pattern there, though I was able to manually correct reasonably well. Obviously, you're going to get a better result by using the standard profile, but this required a massive plus 43 to resolve all of that barrel distortion, so that is not good. And then also we needed about a plus 73 of vignette correction in the corners, and so that means that we've got at least 3 stops of vignette in the corner. And so once again, this is a lens that really needs those electronics to help to complete the optical package. Fortunately, the picture gets much better from there. When it comes to lateral chromatic aberrations, which exhibit on either side of transition areas on the edge of the frame, we can see that there's basically no fringing to see, and the black and white transitions happen quite smoothly. With longitudinal chromatic aberrations that happen before and after the plane of focus, we can see that there is a bit of a blue-green fringing and a little bit of that magenta fringing before the plane of focus, but fortunately it's really not all that bad, and I certainly didn't notice it really in any kind of real-world situation. So much rosier pictures on that front. Now, wide open at f2.8 on a 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1, we can see at a 200% magnification that we have very good contrast and resolution in the center of the frame. We're starting to see that moire pattern that I only see when lenses start to get really sharp. And if we look in the mid frame, we can see that there's great detail and great contrast, and that extends down into the corners, though we can see that some of that acuity is starting to drop. There's certainly a difference from this upper left end of the bill to where we're starting to drop off here into the corner. Overall, however, I would say that we have a very nicely consistent performance across the frame. And if we pop in at a few other spots, we can see that resolution is holding up nicely, and the lens seems to be nicely centered as well. So how does that compare to some recent competitors? Here's the Sigma that I reviewed earlier this year. Now it has a smaller maximum aperture of f3.5 versus f2.8, but with them both wide open, we can see that the Sony is ever so slightly better in the center of the frame. Looking at the mid frame, it also has just a little bit better contrast, and down into the corner, the Sigma here is starting to show an edge and has a little bit better corner performance than what does the Sony. A much more challenging performance comes from the Samyang 24mm F1.8. And so in the center of the frame, I would say that the Sony maybe has a very, very slight edge in terms of contrast and detail. But even as we move towards the center of the frame, mid-frame, we can see that the Samyang is starting to look stronger, and certainly into the corner, even at f1.8, it clearly has an advantage in acuity and contrast in the corner of the frame. If we stop the Samyang down to an equal aperture of f2.8, we can see that it now has an edge in terms of contrast and detail. In the center of the frame, in the mid frame, it looks better, and of course in the corners it was already better, and now it is dominantly better at this point. But to put all of that in perspective, here's a look at a real-world shot, wide open f2.8 from the Sony, and we can see there in the center of the frame, that is just brilliantly sharp at f2.8, and it shows off just how much resolution and contrast this lens has on tap. Now, one thing I noticed when I looked at the MTFs for the lens is that it has most of its performance at f2.8. There's very little extra achieved when stopping down. And so we can see here at f4, there's ever so slightly more contrast, but it would not be detectable without them side by side. In the middle of the frame, things look very similar, and off towards the edge, maybe an edge in contrast compared to f2.8, but not a whole lot there to see. Stopping on down to f5.6 also produces little advantage. So in some ways, the 24mm f2.8G doesn't have that extra gear when you stop it down of increased contrast and sharpness, whereas going back to the Samyang for a moment, it clearly does, to where it is resolving, pretty much off the charts by this point and off into the corners. The distance, or the difference, is quite remarkable how much sharper it is at f5.6 if you compare the two lenses side by side. I noticed the same thing out in the real world, that if I compared an f2.8 shot to an f5.6 shot with the 24G, if I go into a pixel level, there really isn't a whole lot of difference between the two images. So there's both a pro and a con that is here. Here you can see depth of field is starting to help, but in the area where focus is shared, we can see that there's only a very minor contrast bump there. So the upside here is that basically all of the resolution is available on tap from f2.8 on, which that is good. What's not so good is that there isn't a lot of extra resolution to be tapped into as you stop the lens down. Our minimum aperture is f22, and as you would expect with such a small aperture on a high resolution body like my Alpha 1, you can see the diffraction is really starting to rob away a lot of contrast and acuity, and so everything looks just kind of soft and through that kind of Vaseline filter by comparison. So I would not recommend using f22 unless absolutely necessary. Now, while I've highlighted maybe some of the relative negatives compared to some competitors, the truth of the matter is that this is a very high resolving lens that really produced images that I liked. Great color, great detail and contrast, good handling of highlights and light here. It just looks really, really good, and I'm happy with the real world images from the lens. Colors had a nice degree of saturation and pop to them, which made for nice looking images. So as noted previously, our minimum focus distance is a little bit closer if you manually focus, and fortunately the up-close image quality is fairly good at minimum focus, even though if you manually focus closer than what the autofocus allows. And so plane of focus is relatively flat here. You can see it's starting to fall off a little bit, but for a lens with so much distortion, it actually doesn't exhibit a ton of field curvature here, and so you get a reasonably good result up close. The bokeh quality is also quite nice, and so once again we can see great detail and contrast on our subject, but you can see that the fall away on the bokeh is quite good. In this transition area there is some outlining that I see, but as you get further away it gets softer. Here's another shot to where I thought it was nice, and once again, very good detail and contrast on the subject, and then a nice fall away to defocus. That's useful for sure. In this image, I thought that there was a little bit more outlining than what I would like in these needles that are kind of going out of focus. That's a transition zone thing, and so it's not the end of the world. And once again, as you start to get further out to defocus, everything starts to soften up. So overall, I think the bokeh quality is quite good. In this shot, for example, there's a lot going on here, but it shows us the nice bokeh rendering. It also shows us that there's really great detail up close, and you can see that chromatic aberrations are handled really well in these high contrast areas, and the fall off to defocus, a little bit of that kind of jittery zone right there, but then it produces a really nice overall effect. I also threw it onto an APS-C body, a Sony a6600, and you can see here that it still looks really quite good. Detail rendering is nice and contrast is good, and of course you're going to get a little more pronounced magnification with the APS-C body, and so the background looks a little bit more defocused. One area of great strength is that I found flare resistance to be excellent, and so as I moved the sun around in the frame, it was extremely bright. You can see the contrast is held up well, and there are minimal ghosting artifacts. Likewise, if I stop down to f11 at small apertures, I continue to get excellent performance, and even as I move the sun around, I really couldn't find a place where I induced any kind of a negative flare artifacts, so a positive result there. Finally, for coma performance, once again, my caveat is that at kind of midsummer here in the northern climes, things don't get all that dark, and so it's not optimal conditions, but we can see that star points in the center of the frame, they look fairly good here. And as we move off towards the edge of the frame where we're likely to see more coma, what we do see is a bit of like stretching, and its star points are not really round any longer, but neither do I see some of the really bad coma effects to where you start to get the wings or that. This is kind of the worst example that I found, but overall I didn't see a whole lot of negative there, and so it doesn't have the brightest maximum aperture for shooting the night sky, but it certainly does the trick, and if you own the lens, I would use it for that purpose. So really the most negative takeaway there has obviously got to be that extreme barrel distortion and fairly heavy vignette as well. And I was surprised, as mentioned, by that because it's so well masked by the profile. And so at the end of the day, you may not be so affected by it because there is going to be such great profile support, and the profiles do a good job of correcting for the aberrations. I think that this is a lens, frankly, that was designed to be used, not just with the optical correction, but with the electronic correction to give you the final end result. And you're just going to have to treat it as such. Outside of that, however, you've got a very, very good optical performance. And it's marred only by the fact that there is even better performances available, say from the Samyang, at a cheaper price point. However, not everybody is intrigued with the idea of a third-party lens, much less a Samyang lens. And so if you're concerned, is this going to deliver for me? Absolutely. It gives you really great optical results. So at the end of the day, this is a lens that I'm really glad to see added to the overall kit here and the catalog of Sony lenses. So yes, when you release 3 lenses at the same time, you don't get as much of a splash of each individual lens. But you know what? A year down the road, nobody will know the difference. Just if they're shopping for a well-built, compact 24mm lens, there it will be. Likewise, if they wanted a 40mm or a 50mm lens with similar qualities, they can also be found there. These lenses really are all, as we're going to see throughout the series, they're all high performing, they all do a great job, and they're all reasonably priced. And so I think for the right kind of photographer, you're going to be very intrigued by this, in that you don't need a massive maximum aperture for your work. You don't want to pay the high price, you don't want the bigger and heavier build, you want something really, really compact, but you don't want to compromise in terms of the overall build quality and performance of the lens. And if that describes something you're looking for, the Sony FE 24mm F2.8G is going to be a very compelling option for you. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to the image gallery if you want to check out more of the photos there. There's also linkage there to purchase some of my merchandise. You can also follow me on social media, become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.